Hello, everyone. My name is Jamil Smith. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Emancipator, and welcome to our panel this evening, How to Fight Book Bans, an Urgent National Conversation. We're going to be starting off with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, and then we're going to be pivoting to a panel full of experts and activists who are doing their best to make sure that we have free expression and free access to learning, to books, and are fighting book bans throughout the country. Wanted to start with a brief story about a woman named Lily Ann Granderson. I also shared this story in today's edition of the Emancipator's Critical Thinking newsletter. She was also known by the name Millie Cranston. She was a teacher, but her enslavers didn't know that, at least for a good while. She was born into bondage in Virginia around 1816, and she was sold to a Natchez, Mississippi cotton plantation. And there she set up a secretive midnight school that ran until about 2 in the morning. 12 students per class over the course of 7 years, and that added up to hundreds of our fellow captives becoming literate. Now, when missionaries from the North arrived in Natchez in 1863 to set up schooling for enslaved Black people, they were surprised to find that Granderson was several steps ahead of them. The risk that Granderson took was considerable because throughout the South, of course, there were laws to keep enslaved people from becoming literate. However, Granderson found a loophole. While it was unlawful for white people to teach the enslaved, there were no prohibitions against them teaching one another. I thought about Granderson quite a bit this week, and not just because I was preparing to moderate these conversations this afternoon, even as too many people in organizations are working right now to working diligently to ban books. They're working to criminalize knowledge and history. They're working to prohibit free expression. And we not only have the chance to stop them, but to improve the way that we educate our children and ourselves. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, the founder and director of the Center for Anti-Racist Research here at Boston University. Welcome, Dr. Kendi.
Good evening. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. So to start off, I want us to talk about the original book banners. In a video essay that you created for the Emancipator, you said that enslavers were the OG book banners. Can you take a moment to explain what you meant to our audience, and in case they did not see that video essay?
Sure. So during the enslavement era, obviously many abolitionists, Black and white, wrote text describing slavery, challenging slavery, calling for its abolition. And increasingly, particularly in the 1820s and increasingly in the 1830s, more and more of those texts were banned by enslavers. Even the authors of those texts were censured. Even enslavers put bounties on the heads of some of those authors.
So across the world, we're seeing this rise in authoritarianism and fascism. And what we're witnessing here in the United States are book bans serving as a core strategy in that effort. We're seeing attacks on public education. We're seeing an attempt from conservative forces to actively suppress knowledge of the history of the United States, told from anyone who is not an able-bodied cisgender white man. Can you share your assessment of this political moment and why you believe there's been such a focus and attack on educational institutions and on books themselves? What's the impetus?
Well, I think let's draw the connection between where we started on the enslavement era. This was a period in which enslavers literally legislated for ignorance. They not only legislated for ignorance from enslaved people, but they also legislated for ignorance for the vast majority of non-enslaving whites because they wanted those non-enslaving whites to believe that somehow slavery was good for them too. And so if you look at this moment, where you have elected officials who are legislating or pushing policies that harm the vast majority of people, how do you convince those people to support you? By legislating for ignorance. That's
Right.
why it's so critical even in this moment.
So you adapted several of your books for young readers, one of which is Over My Shoulder, as well as written books specifically for children. What have you seen to be the impact of these books, considering, there's been this intensified effort to ban books on race and racism?
Well, what's striking is we're living in a time, particularly in the United States, where there probably is more books written by authors of color, by trans authors, by queer authors, by poor authors. There's a greater diversity of authors and even experiences in books than perhaps at any period in American history. At the same time, many of those books are not reaching young people. And I think there's a direct relationship between this incredible outpouring of literature and this incredible effort to ban these books. But I also think that it appears that some of these elected officials and even citizens do not want everyday people to have the ability to critically engage and even recognize racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, because to recognize, let's say, racism, to recognize sexism, to recognize homophobia through literature is ultimately to recognize these legislators and the policies and ideas that they're putting forth.
Now, I remember back when I was in high school in the early 90s, I never was taught that many books that were by Black people or any other people of color, frankly. I never learned, never read a book about James, by James Baldwin or about James Baldwin, Toni Morris, and so on and so forth. Now we have AP African American Studies courses, we have Black Studies courses in schools, but obviously those have been targeted. You've spoken in the past about the direct attack on Black studies as an attempt to delegitimize and discredit the field. How do you make sense of the heightened backlash against Black studies, particularly within the last 4 years? And how is it impacting your work and the work of your colleagues at other institutions?
Well, I mean, those of us who have been trained in African American studies, like myself, those of us who have been trained to research and even teach about racism, such as myself, our work has been not only banned, but routinely delegitimized by, again, those who are using the racist ideas of their own constituents to fearmonger, to make those constituents or citizens believe that the problem or the source of their pain are those people who don't look like them. So racist ideas are absolutely critical to the maintenance of power. And so that's why there's this continuous effort to challenge and delegitimize and ban and erase those who are actually trying to allow people to be able to critically not be bamboozled and manipulated, as people so often are. And it's just striking because as we increasingly gain a more sophisticated understanding of African American life, of the history of racism, we're being prevented from providing that knowledge to everyday people.
Now, we're about to have a conversation with folks who are fighting book bans on the front lines in their respective communities. Tell me why you think it's important for local community members to get involved in this fight. And also, from your perspective as a frequently banned author, why are grassroots organizers so important in this fight? And what does that mean to you personally?
Well, I think first, when we think about the the specific effort to ban books, this is a highly organized and highly funded sort of effort, and it's an effort that is ongoing, and it's an effort that's not going to stop unless you and I and others figure out ways for us to sort of challenge it in our own backyards. It's a very localized fight at the level of the school board, at the level of the school, at the level of the classroom. So it involves every single one of us to do what we can, to prevent these bans. And I can also just say that as somebody who did not grow up reading, as someone who did not fully understand my history, as someone who did not really understand that the problem wasn't people who looked like me, that the problem was power and policy, to think that those books that started to allow me to understand my own history, myself, my culture, the problem of racism are being taken out of the hands of, of young people. And so then they're going on, continuing to be confused, or even sort of self-destructive is just really, I mean, it just really sort of enrages me because I think I can't help but think of my own story and how books were so liberational, that books were so liberating for me.
Yeah, indeed. And I certainly share that sentiment. And I'm grateful for your time, as always. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kendi,
Thank you,
for
Jamil.
joining us. And now we're going to pivot to our panel. I want to first introduce Claire Bennett, Patricia A. Jackson, Julia Garnett, and Becky Calzada. And what I would like to do, in the interest of time and interest of you being able to express yourselves, have you introduce yourself briefly and tell us a little bit about the fight that you're engaged in. I'll start with you, Julia.
Okay, awesome. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. Um, I am a freshman at Smith College, and I'm originally from Tennessee, where I have done a lot of work fighting censorship in the classroom and in school libraries. And so I was this year's Youth Honorary Chair for National Banned Books Week, and I'm going to continue, to speak out and share my story from the South, now in Massachusetts. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation and, to be able to contribute my perspective and learn from all the amazing panelists we have here.
Thank you very much. Claire, why don't we have you go next?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here as well. I am born and raised in Beaufort, South Carolina, and I became involved in a high school diversity themed book club because of my daughter, Millie. She was involved in that book club, and I was so inspired by what they were doing that I decided to start another chapter of that book club at the school where I work. And that was before censorship came to our county. And so censorship came to our county in the fall of 2022. We had 97 books challenged. They were immediately removed from library circulation. And 6 DALO kids spent the next 9 months going to school board meetings every other week. And we had a 95% success rate. So 91 of those books were returned to circulation, but they are under imminent threat of removal by the state of South Carolina as we speak. So we are definitely still here and still fighting censorship in our county.
Wow. All right. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for staying in the fight. Patricia Jackson, please.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Patricia A. Jackson, and I'm a teacher at Central York High School in South Central Pennsylvania, which had the largest book ban in American history. It was over 400 resources in 2020. And I'm the co-advisor of the Panther Anti-Racist Union, Peru, that got into the fight to bring those books back by challenging the school board, going to school board meetings, having community rallies, having book distributions, and also protesting outside the high school in order to get the attention of the school board. And we won. And those resources were unbanned, only to come into another book ban that was done through paper terrorism, through a parental challenge. But we won that one too, which was really nice. And the kids were just pushing for their rights to read, which are extremely important. And Dr. Kendi taking us to class today, talking about the OG book banners. That was really, really amazing. And I'm interested in getting into the talk with him and everyone about that.
Indeed. And certainly last but not least, Becky.
Thank you for having me. My name is Becky Calzada. I am a district library coordinator in Leander, Texas. I got into this fight against book bans back in October of 2021. Texas has been navigating book challenges for quite a while, and there weren't a lot of organizations, getting engaged yet. I think at the time we thought it was going to go away. It was just a little short thing. But one of the things that we got frustrated with hearing over and over again is the name calling, being called, pornographers, groomers, etc. And my friend Carolyn Foote and I were really frustrated with that misinformation being shared about librarians and the work that they were doing in schools. And so we launched a Twitter hashtag takeover in October of 2021, and thinking we just want to share the impact that books can have on people, not knowing what would happen. But that day we had over 16,000 tweets and were a trending topic all day, and basically just realized that people were seeking hope, but also I think people were seeking to be networked and connected. And so we launched a website that had resources and initial toolkits about how to push back in your with your school board, or to inform your school board, your community, talking points, how to write an op-ed, that sort of thing too. Of course, now we have other resources like Unite Against Book Bans, PEN America. There's so many organizations, National Coalition Against Censorship. And so I hear, though, we still work together, Carolyn and I, to connect others on resources to help shed kind of light into what's happening in communities, because we see a lot of that still. And I think because we're pretty networked, we work hard to help people to navigate just the intellectual freedom challenges that happen, because it can feel very daunting and people just don't know what to do.
Amen. And I'm glad you mentioned PEN America, who is helping us present this conversation today. I want to first start with a question for you all. We know that the most effective pushback to book bans has been at the local level. So what is one strategy that you found to be effective in addressing censorship and book bans in your community? And Becky, I would like to start with you.
So one of the things that has worked really well in our community is transparency. One of the things we heard right off the bat was, we don't know what books are in the library. We don't know how they're selecting books. And it is my belief that transparency can work both ways. And so in encouraging people in local communities to ask questions, to ask what books are being challenged through through like a FOIA request, a public information request. Our school district and several others now, I know, actually post the books that are being challenged so that the community is fully informed, because typically what happens is we have a small minority of even one or two people, that's been reported in news outlets, that are doing the pushing back and wanting the removal of these books. And the community is very unaware. And so it's through staying engaged that allows you to explain and share the purpose and importance of many of the books that they're trying to remove.
Indeed. Julia, how about you go next?
Yeah. I think to the effective community, I think what we found worked really well in my community was working to ensure that we had someone at every meeting, making sure that not just school board meetings, but library board meetings, even just their study sessions, so that our school board knew that there were people paying attention to what was happening, and there were voters paying attention to what's happening. And so trying to mobilize the community, and even online on social media, saying, this is what happened, this is what's happening. Even if you can't make it to the meetings, email your school board, email your county commissioners, know what's happening. And if you're not happy with what you're seeing, make sure that you're aware of who is on the ballot so that you can vote them out when it comes time to do that. So that's something that we found to be really effective, kind of pushing back against some of that rhetoric that was coming out of the school board and coming out of some of the members that were trying to remove books from the library.
Very good. Patricia, how about you?
I love everything that I have just heard. Transparency, voters, all of those things. I feel the most important thing is activating kids and getting children involved, because there is no better civic lesson than them realizing how important their voice is and how important it is to get them to raise their voices so that they can uplift the voices of those who cannot speak. Going to the school board is really important, and that transparency comes through because school boards will claim that they are acting on behalf of the community when some of them are only acting for a small percentage of the community that have the loudest squeak. And when you show them what they're doing and what they're saying, and suddenly it doesn't look like you are representing the entire school community, they start to look a little funny. And when it comes to ballot time, people start voting them out. And when you take these stakeholders, the children, and they're going home to their parents and saying, Mom, Dad, Grandma, look at what's going on, they start to wake up and they start coming up to the board meetings and are saying, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? I question that. So yeah, I like everything I've just heard.
Wonderful. And I guess last but not least, Claire.
Right, same thing. Everything that I just heard is amazing, especially empowering students to use their voices. I mean, they are the ones who are being most impacted by censorship across the country. And like Patricia said, this is not just about this specific moment in time, this censorship challenge. This is about how they engage with civics and communities and community organizing for the rest of their lives. And so I really think that that is an important piece. Another thing that DALA really likes to consider is that censorship is all about subtraction. It's about taking information away from communities. It's about silencing stories, silencing voices, silencing experiences. So we try to be additive, anything that we can add back into the community, whether it is the Beaufort Human Library Project or stocking little free libraries regularly, or attending the marathon reading of the 1619 Project. Like, we try to add back to the community. Yes. So that would be one of my main advice, is just where can you be additive? Where can you counter the subtractive nature of censorship?
Amen to that.
Janina,
Julia, I saw you. Oh, yes, please go ahead.
I just wanted to also add, one of the things that I think we've seen worked really well is when the community does email and communicate with the school board, and even with librarians or administrators, if you're in a school, saying, I support book access, I support intellectual freedom. They oftentimes hear the negative. And so when they know that there's people in the community advocating on behalf of the use of policies that are in place, the reminder that we need to follow those, that makes a big difference too. And it shows the school board that the community is watching, that those checks are in place, and that they want to see those followed.
That's an excellent point to make. Thank you, Becky. Julia, I saw you snapping in approval when Patricia was mentioning kids and school boards. So when you decided to speak out at your school board meeting, which steps did you take to prepare to make your case? I'm curious to know what advice you would give to other students who are considering doing something similar to help them make the biggest impact.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I'm not sure I've ever had the chance to really specifically address that. And I've spoken at quite a few school board meetings at this point, and I think my preparation has been different for every single one. Before my first school board meeting, I found out what was happening the night before. Because my mom is a teacher. And so she came home and she was like, I'm hearing about this at work. I'm hearing about this. And I think that you should speak if this is something that you think you're capable of. This is something you're interested in. And of course, I went online and it was a children's book that they were trying to ban, the book A Place Inside of Me by Zetta Elliott, this beautiful illustrated book about the emotions of a young Black child after he witnesses a police shooting. And it's a book that definitely needed to remain on the shelves of that elementary school library. And so, after going online and watching a video of someone reading that book, I was just so moved as a junior in high school to really write a speech that night and go to the school board. And I always say, my speeches aren't ever finalized. And so I was sitting in the audience after I got there, editing it as I'm listening to my school board members argue like children. I was, just kind of adding based on what I was hearing other people say. And so, it can go from the minimum level of preparation, but if you have that, passion, you can be confident in your message. That's really what's important. And it's nice to have facts. It's nice to be able to support that. But as a student, particularly, your voice matters and your passion matters. And, all it takes is going up there and saying, this book matters to me. This is my story. This is what matters to me. And that is enough to move opinions. And that's enough to show other people that they can do the same. And on the other end of that, there was a school board meeting that I went to defend the book, The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. And for that one, I had done an entire binder's worth of research because I was actually on the review committee for that book at my high school. And so on the other end, I had law cases, I had Supreme Court cases that I had gone to my high school to defend that book with. So preparation is great. Having that knowledge is great. And if you have the time to prepare, I definitely recommend it. But, I think that anything that you can do to defend the freedom to read is worth it, even if it's just going up there for 30 seconds to a minute and saying, this matters, I'm paying attention, and this is not okay, and I'm seeing what you're doing at this meeting. So anything that you can do is enough.
I really like what Julie said about her school board arguing like children, because they have one playbook. and they all look and sound the same. And it goes back to what Dr. Kendi said, legislating for ignorance. It all looks the same.
Mhm. Yes, indeed. We want to encourage folks who are watching. Thank you again for joining us. We want to encourage you to submit questions in the chat on our YouTube page so that we can put them before our panelists as we go along. Uh, we know that book bans create more barriers for children and young adults to access critical information. And for kids of color in particular, they may not see themselves reflected in literature until later in life. I know certainly that was the case for me in many respects. And frankly, my parents had to intervene and make sure that I saw myself in literature and in other forms of art. So I know that there are a lot of folks who can relate to that. But according to the latest data from the ALA, American Library Association, 4,240 unique book titles faced censorship efforts in schools and libraries, and that's just in 2023 alone. And 47% of those titles represent the lived experiences of LGBTQIA plus folks and people of color. Patricia, I want to ask you to share how students in Panthers Anti-Racist Union have responded to reading banned books and which strategies your students have used to keep diverse books in the classroom.
My co-conspirator, Ben Hodge, is the advisor also of the Panther Anti-Racist Union. And as a white man, he has awakened to the fact that he also has been a victim of racism because these books were withheld from him. And one of his favorite authors is Uncle Jimmy, James Baldwin. And one of the things that he did, and that was a focus of Peru, was to buy these banned books. And these books started coming into the classroom, and kids were reading these books and they're kind of looking at you with the little puppy head to the side. That really happened. Things happen like that. Yes, it does. And there's no shame, there's no fragility, there's no guilt. There's a duty of, well, we can't ever let that happen again. And that's why it's okay to share these dangerous ideas in the classroom so that children can be awakened to these things. But also on the other side of it, when we talk about, and Claire said this so well, when we invalidate people's feelings, some of these books take kids on journeys that are familiar, and they may be ugly journeys, but they are familiar journeys and show that the protagonist can come out on the other side. And they say to the reader, you also can come out okay on the other side. And that is the impact of these books. That is why these books need to be kept on the shelf. And one thing personally for me is the removal of these books says to children, you need to be hidden away too, because you experience the same thing and you're dirty. And that should never happen.
Never. Oh my goodness. Yes. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I do. I want to add that, I was born and raised here in Beaufort, South Carolina, and I didn't learn who Robert Smalls was until I was in my 30s. And I took an entire year of South Carolina history, right? We cannot allow that to continue. And I think, to echo what Patricia said, I just recently read about a study. I think it was Gay Ivey and Peter Johnston in 2023. School Library Journal has an article out about this. They did a study that shows that when students choose their own reading, they often choose harder and more complex themes in literature, and they learn more from what they're reading. Their comprehension increases. And so we have to trust our children. A lot of these high school kids are 16, 17, 18 years old. They can vote, they can join the military in South Carolina, they can get married, and they can't learn about the Black experience because it might make them uncomfortable. None of that makes any sense to me. So, some of the best conversations I've ever had have been with teenagers after reading The Bluest Eye, and the lessons that they learn and the things that they take away, I learn from every day.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that. Reading Night by Elie Wiesel, as a child, helped me relate to certainly a lot of my fellow students' experiences and that of their family. So when I got to meet their parents or grandparents, I got to understand a little bit of what they may be going through, the generational trauma that they've endured. So it goes across the line, whether it's racial, whether it's about gender identity, whether it's about religious identity. Certainly, we need a diversity of experiences reflected in the literature the kids are presented with, and to know that they are tough enough to handle.
Yes.
They are tough enough to handle it.
I'd also like to add, there was a 22 study by Scholastic where 59% of parents said that they used books to help students to deal, or their kids to deal with feelings. And I think people don't recognize or realize that books help you to process, but rather than it being like it directly being about you, you get to use the characters' experiences to see how they navigated, whether it's grief or anger or love or sadness, whatever those feelings and emotions are. And then I think the other thing that I think is important too is that, just as Dr. Kendi said, is we're living in a time where now publishing has opened up opportunities for BIPOC authors to share, and you now have a true own voice speaking to that experience. I can't speak, for a Black experience because I'm not Black, but I can certainly speak to a Latino experience because I grew up in South Texas. And so I think when you have those rich experiences, that lends itself to the story. And it has the nuances that you see within a book that help to build understanding. And so then when I think about now, what if we're talking about a nonfiction book? Because right now we may be talking about fiction. The work of nonfiction authors, they do so much research, and whoever is doing that research is sharing that perspective. So we aren't going to have something like the 1619 project. I didn't have that growing up, but it's banned in Texas because the state has banned it. But yet we don't have that experience, that history to help build context and understanding for the entire history, for all the perspectives that we're living that history.
Becky, on that note, you're being a librarian in Texas. I want to know, like Texas, as you've mentioned, has banned more books than any other state in the country. And yesterday, well, I'm sorry, not yesterday, but earlier last week, we saw the 2024 National Friends of Libraries Week conclude. And from your perspective, I want to know which specific steps can we all take as citizens to strengthen and defend our public libraries?
So I think a lot of it has to do with showing up and being engaged. I think about right now, recently, this past week, the Montgomery County Library, which is northeast or northwest of Houston, they took the book Colonization and the Wampanoag story. They decided to change that story from a fiction or nonfiction to fiction. They just decided to just change the classification. And that happens because they have a board that does not have librarians, so the professionals are not at the table. But the only reason this was discovered was because a community member reached out and emailed to ask why this was changed suddenly. If you know this book, this is actually part of a series called the Race and Truth series that just published by Penguin. And, to think that just as easy as that, they could change something that is written by an Indigenous author about their experience in the history, and then it's now classified as fiction is kind of crazy. So I think though too, they did go back and change back the classification this past week. But on the same token, nobody would have known, it would have stayed as it was if there was not an engaged community pushing back, asking questions. I'd like to think I can trust my public library, but I also think too, within the different boards and different communities, that's part of the piece of being engaged in the voting process, is to know what the agendas are of candidates and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, we're living in a time where there's a lot of single issue candidates that feel like they can make change for the entire community. And so when the community gets engaged and says, this is not okay because we want to have a good representation on our libraries, we want to have professionals at the table helping make these decisions, those are important, critical things. But if nobody's paying attention, these sort of things kind of slip in.
Indeed. And if I can add just one note, certainly I didn't learn about it until it became international news in places like The Guardian. And, of course, there was local folks reporting on it. And I want to encourage folks who are watching, if you see something like this happening in your community, contact the press. Even if you're there in Texas, you have outlets that are there reporting good things, Texas Tribune, the Barbed Wire, Texas Monthly, Houston Chronicle. Folks are trying to get the truth out. And so make sure that you don't sit there and think that no one's going to care or no one can know about these things. Please call your local newsrooms, call national newsrooms, international newsrooms, and let people know about these things. Becky, I wanted to follow up real quick if I could, and I would love if everyone could potentially weigh in on this. There's the school library, and then there's other library. We have to think about, what's the power of a school library versus, say, a community library or, what have you.
So school libraries are typical, well, actually, let me step back. Oftentimes a parent will take kids to their public library when they're little. They'll go to the lap time, the story time kind of thing, go check out books. And of course, I think back when I went when I was young, there were no even digital books. And so now there's also that digital access. When a student goes to school, though, whether in their elementary, middle, or high school, they'll have access to a school library, hopefully, and hopefully a school library that has a certified school librarian. There's guidelines that school libraries have to follow. We can't have everything, and I don't think there's any library that can have everything, but we have to follow the selection policy and guidelines that are laid out by the school districts. And then, of course, there's the public library. They have their own governing policies. They're very different. They're organized very differently, too, because they are serving an entire community, whereas a school library is serving an elementary pre-K to 5 or 6 to 8, middle school, high school, whatever they're serving. You might even have an early college, high school library. So everything's a little different. Of course, they're run by the school libraries. I think the thing that people don't realize and recognize is that oftentimes we hear the statement, "I'm not banning a book. They can get it at their public library, or they can buy the book." And there's a lack of recognition, first of all, to the fact, or there's an assumption that a family can purchase a book, first of all, and not everybody has the means, depending on your economic status. Maybe you're a check to check family and you don't have the extra funds. The other piece that people think too is like they can go to their public library. I live in a very large school district, over 200 square miles, and there are places in our schools where there's a book desert. Other than the school library is the only place that a student can get a book because our public library is over 20 miles away. And so we need to think about those things because, book access makes a difference. The more books that kids read, the better the reader they are. We also know that if there are the number of books in a home determine the reading level of a student too. And so we need to keep those in mind and make sure that students have access to books wherever they can go, because that makes a difference in terms of their education.
Indeed. I see a lot nodding heads. So Patricia, let me go to you first.
Becky speaks to privilege, which is really interesting when people say, well, they can go buy the book. Well, not everybody's got the pocketbook or the deep pockets that you have, or has the convenience to go and get in a car because they don't have a car, for whatever reason. High school libraries need to be as close to a public library as possible. Whereas you make adjustments for a middle school library and you make even more adjustments for an elementary library. What some people think, because of legislating to ignorance, is that a 6-year-old can go and get push. That's not possible. Okay. And normal humans who can think clearly would understand this. There are different policies that will advocate for what kinds of books need to be in the school district by their grade level. What's interesting is our school district had a policy where if a parent challenged a book, it was immediately removed from the shelves. It was taken from all the other children, all the other communities. And we passed an administrative regulation where that can never happen again. If a parent objects to a book, what they have to do is they simply have to opt out. And you had the side that wanted to do this, and they were like, oh, well, there are so many parents that are aggrieved. One parent, one family, and what they said is they didn't want their middle school child reading young adult novels, and that was it. And it was taken care of, and that's all that had to happen. It didn't need to be all this furore and all this shame and all this nonsense. Just a quiet, I don't want my child reading this book. Okay.
Precisely.
Yeah, if I could just add to that quickly, I think it's really about like accessibility and just like if you grew up like me as a queer student who did not have diversity in my Tennessee libraries, I thought something was wrong with me because there weren't books that represented me, because in my school libraries that didn't exist. And I grew up surrounded by books, but I still grew up with this perception that something was wrong and that I was broken. And I just think, like, what kind of message is it sending to the students if you're having to pull books off the shelves that represent their lived experiences, and it makes them feel unsafe to talk about what they're experiencing, and that leads to a lot of, mental health problems, which I kind of experienced and watched happen in my high school and with some of my friends, and that was really hard to go through. And I know people who didn't want to go talk to a therapist or a guidance counselor, didn't feel safe to talk to their parents, but they could get comfort out of a book. And I think that makes it all worth it if just one student can pick up a book in a school library and believe the world can be better than it currently is. I think there's a lot of hope there, and through accessibility, students can find that hope. And that's something that's really empowering.
That's a really good message. Thank you very much, Julie. Claire, I want to ask you, of course, DALO, which we should remind folks stands for Diversity Awareness Youth Literacy Organization, emphasizes that book bans and acts of censorship are reductive and subtractive, while its model is additive. Now, what strategies and tactics does DALO use to foster this community of literacy?
So one of the things, well, DALO originally started as just a book club. It was a diversity-themed high school book club that focused on community literacy prior to censorship coming to our county. So we would hold monthly teddy bear picnics where we meet at the local farmers market and read to little kids diverse picture books. That has become a monthly, sometimes bi-monthly event. So we're putting books and diverse books into spaces where they wouldn't necessarily have been otherwise. We also participate with our district's Title I literacy nights at Title I elementary school. So, when teenagers walk in the room to read to little kids, they get very, very excited. They love the teenagers, and that is super helpful in promoting literacy in our community. We started last year during Banned Books Week, a project of stocking little free libraries just for Banned Books Week. And the kids enjoyed it so much that we have expanded that. So that is now something that we do ongoing, depending on the month. If it's Hispanic Heritage Month, then we will pick, books that are under that theme, or if it's Pride, just depending on what month, what makes sense. Or generally, we like to stock those little free libraries with like pro-library, pro-public education, pro-librarian books. So that is one of the strategies that we use. Also, we host an event that's called the Beaufort Human Library. You may have heard of. There's human libraries all over the world, but we try to bring together diverse members of our community with other community members so that there are human books, and then there are readers, which is the public, the community come in and they get to meet people whose story might be very different from theirs. And DALO students serve as bookmarks, so they're kind of like the liaison between the books and the readers. And we do that once a year. And that has actually happened also at one of the high schools. I think they just had their 4th one at Battery Creek High School on this past Friday. So those are a lot of the strategies. And one of the things that it's kind of a dual purpose, right? Like we are trying to add literacy and access to literature back into our community, and also provide like multiple pathways to advocacy for students, because not every student is going to be able to stand up at a school board meeting or in front of a legislative body and speak publicly. That's not for everybody. But we consider every single pathway to advocacy as equally worthwhile and valid, and everything that a student chooses to do is worthwhile and valid. And so we want to try to provide not only that diverse access to literature in the community and additive in our community, but we want to give our students many opportunities to advocate. So I love all of the things we do, but I think probably my most favorite thing is the teddy bear picnic, because it's like bright and it's colorful and there's stuffed animals and there's little kids and it's very fun.
Oh, teddy bear picnic sounds amazing, even as an adult. No, actually, that leads me to another question that I have really for all of you. So, we've talked a lot about children and their access to books, but book bans are also, of course, aimed at books that target adults. And I think, a lot about books that I loved is, when I was younger, there were ostensibly adult books, something like the 1969 novel, The Spook Who Sat by the Door by Sam Greenlee. And I'm sure we all have favorites that have been banned. I'm curious to know what you've seen or what you've heard from adults who, think about these books or think about the impact those banned books have had on their lives. And, Patricia, I'll start with you.
Let me start on the other side, the skeptics. I remember a gentleman who challenged me at an award ceremony and said, but I think these books should be banned, particularly Not All Boys Are Blue by George Johnson. And I asked him why. And he said, well, I read a passage. And I said, well, do you know what the book is about? And he didn't. So I gave a little summary of what the book was about. And you could just see him kind of step back and pause. And he said, I have a niece who just came out 2 weeks ago, and that's very important to me. I'm going to go and read the book. And it just happened with the conversation. So that's on one side of it. On the other side of it, there's a bewilderment with adults. Like, why is that even banned? I don't even understand why that's being banned. And then there's this defiance that, well, I'm going to go get it and read it anyway. And they come back and they start talking about the book and why was this banned? I don't understand. And that's where your transparency comes in, because then, at least at the high school level, you have parents or community members, stakeholders who will come in and say, I read this book and I don't get you. And one of the people who orchestrated the book ban in our district actually came into a meeting and read the introduction to the George Johnson book on the record and said, while I don't necessarily agree if this book should be in the library, what people are saying about it is not true. The jaw dropped. Go and read the book. Don't get incited by a paragraph or by a section, because that's what they do to incite their people and to legislate their ignorance.
Anyone else have a thought on that?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you just said, Patricia, and I think I'd like to add, like, what I've personally witnessed is it's a lot harder for school boards to ban older books, because the adults kind of in the situation can be like, oh, I read that book in high school. Why would they ban it? Whereas with newer material, they're not as aware of it. And so you run into things like you were talking about, where they've just read excerpts and like, well, this is the new thing. This is just new. This is, something I don't agree with, and I'm not going to read it. But if you do go and read the whole book with the context, you can see why it's so valuable. And so I just think that there's really a difference between the old and the newer books, and that some of the adults in the situation are a little more maybe ignorant than with some of the older texts that they read in high school. And so, my school board had a hard time justifying banning The Perks of Being a Wallflower, because it's been around, it's been on the shelves, and they didn't have a problem with it then. So why should they have a problem with it now? And we're seeing that with similar books all over the country, and it can be, frustrating when these books have been around a while. And then with the newer books, they're just being put out of context. I had school board members reading in front of a room full of people, including myself as a minor and other students, what they deemed as explicit text. But if you don't want us to read it, why are you reading it to us at a school board meeting? So that happened several times, just pulling parts out of context to kind of incite that anger from the group that wants it banned. And so I don't know, I find that very interesting to hear and to learn about and to witness.
And, I think Julia speaks to the shock value they're trying to do. And I think what many don't realize is that students have rights. They have First Amendment rights. And in most school board governance, it talks about that a school cannot remove a book based on an idea they disagree with. And there's legal precedents on that. It's education versus PICO, Board of Education versus PICO. Anyway, and so when a book doesn't even go through its own due process, a district could be vulnerable to a lawsuit because they're letting a particular specific idea be used and leveraged to remove a book versus judging the book as a whole, which I think is what happens in a reconsideration, is that a book is reviewed in totality and there's context versus we're just stringing passages and pieces of things together.
I wanted to share a quick story about one of our DALO students. He reads every single book that we read with DALO. His grandmother reads with him, and she has loved every single one of them until they read The Bluest Eye. And she told him, it was just too dark. And she just really just had a hard time with it until she learned that her daughter, so my student's mother, who's a teacher, that there was a student in her class who was experiencing sexual abuse from her family, and realized that the relevance of the material, right? And so I think that's one of the best examples I've seen of somebody understanding through the process of reading and connecting that with a real life experience, how important reading books like The Bluest Eye can be. And so I love that. We always, Patrick and his grandmother reading every single book that we read for daylight together is one of my favorite stories.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing too? I think people
Certainly.
forget that a library is a place of voluntary inquiry. Nobody is ever forced to go into a library. Nobody is ever forced to check out a book. And then I think people forget that if you don't really like a book, you can put it down. And I participated in South by, I had the South by Southwest EDU. I had the chance to listen to George M. Johnson, and he talked about, if I don't like Dr. Pepper in a grocery store, I don't tell the grocery store to stop selling Dr. Pepper. That one book might not be for you, but that one book might be for someone that needs it. And I think we have to remember that in context of what the purpose of a library is.
We actually had a community member take the Johnson book to the police department and try to get one of our book distributors arrested for distributing.
I believe that.
It was crazy.
Well, I think that speaks to the real motivations for some folks to want these book bans, which is that they are scared of people having this knowledge. And, certainly let's just identify some of the folks that we're talking about there. We've said a lot of but we're talking about, a lot of right-wing mega donors, a lot of right-wing politicians, and experts say that the rise of book bans is promoted by groups linked to these people.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know, how certainly one of our viewers is asking, have you noticed the influence of big money on the book banning of efforts in your communities? And certainly, Becky, I can maybe start with you with that.
Well, I think the way we notice is because our newspapers and I think not even just newspapers, but people that are just wanting to be informed are bringing that to light. We do see a lot of that in Texas. We see a lot of outside money. We see inside money too, whether it's in influencing school board elections or state elections, or I think you have to pay attention, and you have to pay notice. I think the other thing we see too a lot of is the gerrymandering, of places and spaces, and we see a lot of that. And a lot of that, I think it's rooted in control. And if you're not paying attention to where the money is coming from, then you're not going to know any different. I want to know, say, if I'm participating in a school board election and I'm voting, I want to make sure that the person that's running is really running because they care about the school that they want to work in, that they believe in the community, that they're invested in our community. That's important. But oftentimes we see outside money and to do harm.
Indeed. And another one of our viewers, if I may interject, is asking about how we can start going on offense nationally. Carla's asking, she's noticing how some states like Washington State have, made, created national legislation,
Freedom to read.
Yeah, exactly. And, requirements to learn African American history, to learn Indigenous American history. Curious to know, Claire, I'll start with you. How do you think, we can tell folks to start going on offense?
Well, I think vote first and foremost, you need to vote. And I think, I love, like in Chicago and Illinois passing the no book bans ban, right? Like that would be amazing. That's not likely to happen here in South Carolina anytime soon. So I think, voting in your local elections. And I think that we need a great outcome in this 2024 election so that we can preserve the National Department of Education, which is, Project 2025 would like to shut down. And if that happens, if there is no, Department of Education, then that means that South Carolina is making all of the decisions for us. And Project 2025 is already here in South Carolina. And so, I would like to see more national support, if possible, for education policy and have that trickle down to states that are not going to have a governor pass a ban on book bans.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And certainly on that note, it's not simply, not just Project 2025 that's proposing that. The Republican nominee for president himself has directly said that that is what he wants to do. So, it's yes, it's about voting, but also making sure that as you vote, consider what the people who are running for office are proposing, and make your an educated decision. Would anyone else like to offer a thought on how going on?
Definitely. It comes back to your school boards. And as the stakeholders, you have a right to know who is funneling money into their campaigns when they are running for the board of directors. And, in our case, we have around us in our county, we have the Independence Law Center, which has been identified as a hate group. And this is a law center that is writing policy against LGBTQIA plus people and people of color, and sort of piecemeal giving it to school board members who are clueless. Okay, they're just dumb. Okay, and they're just putting this piecemeal in as school board policy, and it's passing in some places. The ILC was responsible for the creationism, the intelligent design thing that happened in the Dover School District. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So I'm going to say a wonderful acronym that is out there fighting the battle, the ACLU. They hover, they are waiting to assist people. You simply just need to get out there and make those connections and let them know. But you can see the playbook is the same. Yep. From school board to school board, it does not change. They say the same rhetoric because the same people are funneling the money and telling them what to say. But people are asleep. Oh, it couldn't happen. Look what happened at Central. Yeah. And then we have 3 or 4 districts that are now in turmoil because they didn't listen. They weren't watching. They weren't following closely enough. And now they're going to have the battle.
Indeed. These folks are telling us what they want to do. We should believe them.
Absolutely.
We have about exactly. We have about 5 minutes left. And I want to take another question from one of our viewers, Terry from Pennsylvania. She's moving soon, and she's wondering how to find and connect with other banned book advocates in a new community. And Julie, I'll start with you. Do you have any suggestions for her and other folks in our audience who are wondering what they can and should do to organize against censorship in their particular community?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much out there. And to start, I think I'll go back to Claire's point, that it doesn't have to be this huge action. It doesn't have to be a speech in front of the school board. It can be writing about what you're seeing. It can be anonymously submitting a form to the ACLU. There is so much out there for you to get involved. You can take small steps. And as I said before, anything you can do is enough. And in terms of finding community, I did feel alone for a while before, I started publicly speaking out because I didn't know where to look and I didn't know how much support is really out there. And if you're moving to kind of a red community, I kind of considered where I live a little bit of a bubble. I didn't, because it's the South, so a lot of the time people are really like polite to your face, and so so I didn't really see the tension, and I hadn't come out yet, and so I really didn't see this division until I went to my first school board meeting, and I didn't know where to sit, and I sat in the middle, and that was the wrong spot. The one behind me ended up being kicked out, but I witnessed this division, and within all of the hate that was in that room, there was so much love and joy in collective action that I found. And I found this beautiful, diverse group of people who rallied around me to support me as a queer student, as a student speaking out, just by simply showing up to a meeting, showing up to events. And there's groups online. I would encourage you. I know that a lot of young people aren't on Facebook, but I am, and you can look in your community and find different groups. So you can kind of find maybe a more supportive group if you look online in that community. And if you're kind of in a hard place and you maybe don't know like where to start or if there, I'm sure there are people in your community who will support you, even if it's a small group. But there are so many online resources, so many online groups, resources. I personally started with the National Coalition Against Censorship when I looked to expand outside of my own community and start making change on a national level as well. And they had so many amazing resources. So check out those websites, and just, anything you can do is enough. I don't think I can say that enough, because, they're the teachers, the students, the librarians, they love to just see that support and feel that support, and it can come out of small actions, because if we all take these small steps, just by voting or by making a little speech or anything, it all adds up, and it all like creates collective change, and that's what we need right now, in this country.
I want to encourage people to join Unite Against Book Bans. They are a national organization. They will not email you multiple times. They will only email you when there is a book ban action or attempt happening in your area. And so they're very connected at a local level to bring out and get the grassroots community engaged. And so Unite Against Book Bans is a great resource. And they've got a lot of statistics, toolkits. They're great.
Indeed. Patricia or Claire?
I would echo everything that
Go ahead, Claire.
Sorry, that's my fault.
I'll echo everything that Julia and Becky just said, and re-echo ACLU. I also think you can kind of find the connectors in your community, and there always seems to be in every community people who are good at organizing and bringing others together. One of the best one of those in my community is my co-mentor, Jonathan Haupt. He brings people together to fight censorship and to add lots of amazing things back in the community. So I'd say look for the connectors.
And as far as networking, find your place. You don't have to be the one sitting at the mic at the board meetings every time. We had one family, the Hill family, they kept a timeline of all the things the school board said, so that when racism started to look ugly and homophobia looked even uglier, and they wanted to backlash to say I didn't say that, the Hill family had a full accounting of what they did and probably buried these people when the voters came to the polls. So you can always find your niche, whether it's, distributing, getting people to organize, getting the timelines together, or speaking at the mic, or talking with kids and just getting them rallied to go and do what they have to do. So find your place.
Indeed. And I'll offer two last bits of advice. One is to, speak to the folks in your own home. Make sure that you are engaging with folks and helping them understand what's going on. And to that point, make sure that you continue to stay informed, continue to read about what's happening with regards to book bans in the press, and make sure that you are reaching out, whether it's through a letter to the editor, or whether it's through a pitch of an op-ed. And certainly you can do so here at the Emancipator. So we'd be happy to solicit you to go to our Pitch Us link at the bottom of our page at theemancipator.org. If you have tips with regards to what's happening in communities, you can write us at info@theemancipator.org. Certainly let us know, and we're going to do our best to make sure that we get the news out to the folks. So again, I could talk to this panel for hours about this topic. You've all been wonderful, and frankly, I might just keep you on this Zoom so we can just keep doing that and say goodbye to everybody else. But let me just first say thank you to you all: Claire Bennett, Patricia A. Jackson, Julia Garnett, and Becky Calzada. Thank you very much for spending your Sunday afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you all for watching us on YouTube, whether you're watching live or you're watching much later. We do appreciate your time and your attention to this topic. And also want to give one last but not least thank you to Dr. Ibram X. Kendi for taking time to speak with us about this urgent issue. Please, again, make sure that you stay informed, stay on top of this issue, and stay in the fight. All right, everybody.